Dawn had not yet broken over the city when the first crack echoed across the narrow stone streets. A gunshot, distant, muffled by fog, rolled through the alleys like a warning. The air smelled of damp wood gunpowder and the sour tang of fear. Merchants were already shuttering their shops. Horses stomped nervously. In the quiet before the storm, Paris felt like a living organism holding its breath. And then, a heartbeat later, the sound came again, louder, closer. A crowd surged toward the Bastille. From above, from a rain-slick rooftop, where a lone sentry watched with trembling hands, the city looked like a pot left too long on the fire, bubbling, expanding, ready to spill over. This was not merely the beginning of a riot. It was the ignition spark of a repeating pattern that would echo across centuries, toppling empires, installing new powers, and reshaping the world map. A pattern so consistent, so mathematically predictable, that historians rarely speak of it directly. Yet every nation trapped inside it feels its pressure. A pattern with 6 distinct stages. France crossed them first. Russia followed. Cuba burned through them like fuel. And now, in a way that feels familiar, uncomfortably familiar, the United States stands at what experts would call stage 4. But to understand why, we must journey backward. Through blood-soaked revolutions, barricaded cities, collapsing institutions, and the men who stood at the center of it all. Men who didn't create revolutions, but accelerated them. A cycle not of chaos, but of design. Revolutions do not just happen. They follow a sequence, slow at first, then fast, then suddenly explosive. Historians have given this repeated process many names. The Thermidorian cycle, the revolutionary curve, the six-fold descent, the pressure and release pattern. But one name stands above the rest, the six-stage revolution pattern. It begins with a fracture, ends with a purge, and in the middle lies the most dangerous phase of all, stage 4, breakdown of institutional legitimacy. That is where the United States stands today. But before we examine the modern world, we must first travel through the past, through 3 nations whose revolutions still cast shadows over our present. The architects of collapse. Every revolution has its architects. Some were visionaries. Some were opportunists. Some were tyrants created by the fires of history. And all of them, knowingly or not, pushed their nations through the same 6 stages. France, the philosophers and the general on one side, stood Maximilien Robespierre, a thin, sharp-featured lawyer, with eyes like cold steel. He believed that virtue required terror, and terror required control. On the other stood Napoleon Bonaparte, a young officer watching the chaos with a calculating calm. Between them lay the rise and fall of the French monarchy, the creation of the first modern republic, and the blood-soaked reign that followed. France was the first to reveal the cycle. Russia, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin in 1917, as snow-hammered Petrograd and breadlines wrapped around frozen blocks, a different kind of fire began to spread. Vladimir Lenin, returning from exile, carried a blueprint. Dismantle the old order, crush the opposition, seize the levers of communication. Leon Trotsky, with his sharp intellect and sharper rhetoric, supplied the momentum. Joseph Stalin, watching silently, supplied something else: inevitability. Russia took the French pattern and perfected it. Cuba, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in the humid heat of the Sierra Maestre Mountains. 2 men rehearsed history once more. Castro, with his booming speeches and iron determination. Che, the revolutionary romantic with a rifle slung across his shoulder. Together, they dragged the island through all 6 stages: fast, violent, total. Cuba proved the pattern could fit even a country of only a few million. The paradox at the heart of revolutions. Here lies the paradox that drives this documentary. Revolutions promise liberation, but they almost always end in centralization. They begin with citizens demanding freedom from a broken system. They end with new rulers cementing a stronger, more rigid system in its place. Freedom births control. Chaos births hierarchy. Revolt births authority. This is not coincidence. It is the pattern. The people rise. The institutions fracture. The power vacuum expands. and someone, always someone, steps in to fill it. The question is never will a leader emerge. The question is what kind of leader will the chaos create? Foreshadowing the 6 stages, the next chapters of this documentary will peel back the structure piece by piece. We will explore the pressure builds, economic strain, social division, elite competition, loss of trust, media fractures, political gridlock, public anger, the spark of crisis, a scandal, an event that shatters the illusion of stability, legitimacy collapse, institutions lose authority, narrative split, polarization becomes irreversible. The power grab, a figure or faction seizes control through elections, force, or emergency measures. The new order, a new system, replaces the old, sometimes freer, usually less. These stages do not describe ideology. They describe mechanism. They can produce monarchies, republics, dictatorships, juntas, democracies, socialist states, and everything in between. They do not care who you are, only where you stand. And now, the modern warning, as we open this investigation, a new question looms. How close is the world's most powerful nation to repeating history? France was first. Russia was second. Cuba was third. And today, according to multiple indicators, economic strain, political fragmentation, institutional distrust, the United States stands in the exact position those nations occupied at the beginning of their most volatile chapter. Not collapse, not civil war, but a critical tipping point where the legitimacy of the system begins to unravel. What happens next doesn't depend on prophecy. It depends on pattern. A pattern written by centuries of revolution. A pattern we are about to decode. Revolutions do not emerge from thin air. They grow, they simmer, and they follow a structure, a sequence that transcends geography, culture, and ideology. The 6-stage revolution pattern is not a theory created in hindsight. It is an observable blueprint, seen again and again in the rise and fall of nations. To understand how France, Russia, and Cuba were consumed by this pattern, and why the United States now mirrors stage 4, we must walk through each stage with precision, peeling back the forces, the architects, and the consequences that shape them. Stage 1. Pressure builds the slow accumulation of strain beneath the surface. All revolutions begin long before the first riot, long before the first manifesto, long before the first gun is fired. They begin in households, in markets, in conversations whispered behind closed doors. They begin with pressure, economic, political, cultural. France, the weight of debt and hunger in the decades before 1789. France was bleeding from within. The monarchy had spent fortunes fighting wars it couldn't win, supporting revolutions abroad while failing to quell frustration at home. Bread prices soared. Harvests failed. Taxes crushed the peasantry, while the aristocracy remained untouched. The pressure was not sudden. It was cumulative. 1788, bread consumed half the average worker's income. 1789, national debt consumed over half the government's budget. By spring, Paris housed 120,000 unemployed citizens. The pot was boiling long before anyone stormed the Bastille. Russia, a giant strangled by its own past in the early 20th century. The Russian Empire looked powerful from the outside, vast, militarized, intimidating. But inside it was collapsing. Industrialization had arrived too late and too unevenly. Millions of peasants lived in medieval conditions. Factories were overcrowded, wages stagnant, and the Tsar's regime remained rigid and disconnected from suffering. The pressure mounted. Food shortages worsened during World War I. Soldiers lacked boots, ammunition, and leadership. Inflation exceeded 400% by 1917. Petrograd was a city on the brink. Cuba, the dictatorship and the divide in Cuba, pressure built not from famine, but from inequality and corruption. Fulgencio Batista ruled with a tight grip, backed by military officers, wealthy elites, and foreign interests. Casinos thrived, hotels glittered, but rural Cubans lived in poverty. Literacy remained low. Land was concentrated in the hands of a few. The conditions were ripe for an explosion. The mechanism of Stage 1 teaches a simple truth. Revolutions begin when the gap between the people's expectations and their lived reality becomes intolerable. When inequality stretches too wide. When institutions serve too few. When the promise of the system no longer matches the experience of the citizens. Pressure builds slowly. Then, suddenly everything shifts. Stage 2. Legitimacy cracks the moment people begin doubting the system itself. A nation can survive hardship. What it cannot survive is a collapse of belief. When citizens lose faith in institutions, courts, media, leaders, legislatures, the psychological foundation of the state begins to fracture. France, the monarchy's fatal blindness in the years before the Revolution. Louis XVI did not simply lose control. He lost credibility. Attempts to fix financial crises failed. Efforts to reform taxation died in the face of aristocratic resistance. Every failed policy, every contradictory decree, widened the crack. 1789, the monarchy's authority had evaporated. The people no longer believed the king could solve the crisis. Worse, many believed he was the crisis. Russia. The Tsar's terminal decline, Nicholas II, suffered the same fate. His decision to take personal command of the army during World War I meant every defeat fell on his shoulders. Rumors swirled around the influence of Rasputin, weakening public trust. The Duma lost relevance. The Orthodox Church lost influence. When bread riots erupted in 1917, the Tsar's orders to fire on protesters were ignored by soldiers. Legitimacy had cracked beyond repair. Cuba, Batista's last days of illusion. Batista's regime maintained the illusion of control through bribery and intimidation. But by the mid-1950s, journalists criticized his corruption. Students protested his brutality. Rebels gained public sympathy. Even foreign allies questioned his stability. A government that once projected strength now projected desperation. The mechanism of stage 2 always looks peaceful from the outside. But internally, the foundations are eroding. A nation collapses when its citizens stop believing the system can fix itself. This loss of faith becomes the fault line upon which stage 3 erupts. Stage 3, the spark, the event that turns tension into fire. Every revolution has a moment, not the cause, but the trigger. France. The tennis court oath and the Bastille. When delegates were locked out of a meeting hall on June 20, 1789, they met in a nearby tennis court and swore not to disband until France had a constitution. It was an unprecedented act of defiance. 3 weeks later, the storming of the Bastille turned defiance into revolution. Russia. The February bread protests on February 23, 1917. Thousands of Petrograd women marched for bread. Workers joined. Soldiers sympathized. What began as a simple protest spiraled into a national revolt. Officers hesitated. Barracks mutinied. The empire collapsed, not from battlefield defeat, but from a single spark. Cuba. The failed attack that lit the fuse. Castro's attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953 was a military disaster. But its aftermath, the trial, the imprisonment, the "history will absolve me" speech, turned Castro into a symbol of resistance. The spark did not topple Batista. It made Castro impossible to ignore. The mechanism of stage 3 is psychological. People realize their anger is shared. Shared anger becomes organized. Organized anger becomes action. The spark is not random. It is the moment a population recognizes its power. Stage 4, institutional collapse, the stage where nations stand today, and where danger accelerates. This stage is the tipping point. It is not yet a revolution, but the ground beneath society begins to fail. Institutions clash. Narratives split. Trust evaporates. The old system is alive in name only. France. The fall of the monarchy between 1789 and 1792. France suffered. Financial meltdown, hyperinflation, street violence, political chaos, a monarchy struggling to survive. By the time Louis XVI attempted to flee France in the flight to Varennes, his legitimacy was permanently destroyed. Stage 4 had become irreversible. Russia. The provisional government's collapse after the Tsar abdicated. Russia attempted to rebuild itself. But war exhaustion, factionalism, and economic chaos paralyzed the new government. Lenin exploited the vacuum with precision, controlling communication networks, organizing workers, and mobilizing militias. When the provisional government lost military support, the revolution began. Cuba. The Batista regime implodes. By late 1958, Batista was isolated. Rebels controlled rural provinces. Urban uprisings multiplied. Foreign confidence evaporated. The army defected in waves. Batista fled the country on New Year's Eve. Stage 4 ended with a plane lifting from Havana's airport, and the revolution began hours later. The mechanism of Stage 4 is the most dangerous stage because the system still exists, but its authority does not. Modern experts argue that the United States shows Stage 4 indicators: economic pressure, political polarization, institutional distrust, fragmented media ecosystems, cultural division. This does not predict collapse, but it suggests instability. Stage 4 decides whether a nation stabilizes or falls into Stage 5. Stage 5. The power grab the moment when the vacuum is filled. When old institutions fail, someone always rises to replace them. France, Robespierre, and the Reign of Terror. The collapse of the monarchy opened the door for the Jacobins. Robespierre, with his cold logic and unwavering ideology, used fear, tribunals, and executions to force unity. Terror became governance. Soon after, Napoleon filled the next vacuum. Russia, Lenin, and the Bolshevik consolidation. Lenin's strategy was simple but devastating. Control communications. Control transportation. Control armed forces. Eliminate rivals. By 1918, the Bolsheviks had seized every critical system. Stalin would later expand this control into total domination. Cuba. Castro claims the island when Batista fled. Castro marched into Havana to thunderous applause. But applause is not governance. Slowly, methodically, Castro consolidated, nationalizing industries, eliminating rivals, aligning with the Soviet Union, establishing one-party rule. Stage 5 is not the victory lap. It is the takeover. Stage 6, the new order, the final stage, a reset, not an ending. Stage 6 replaces the old system with something new. France created a republic, then an empire, then another republic. Russia formed the USSR, reshaping global politics for a century. Cuba transformed into a communist state aligned with the Soviet bloc. The new order may bring stability or oppression, reform or rigidity, freedom or control, but it always closes the cycle. It always prepares the next. The six-stage revolution pattern is not ideology, not prophecy, not speculation. It is structure, a structure that has defined modern history. France followed it. Russia followed it. Cuba followed it. And today, indicators suggest the United States stands at the most delicate and decisive point of the cycle. Stage 4, the collapse of institutional legitimacy. What happens next is not predetermined, but the pattern is clear. And history rarely grants second chances to nations that ignore it. It is quieter, heavier, as if history itself is pausing to take a breath. Cities rebuilt, leaders replaced, flags rewritten. Yet beneath the surface, the old tensions never fully disappear. They linger like dust in the corners of a room, waiting for the next gust of wind to disturb them. And so, as we conclude this journey through the six-stage revolution pattern, we are confronted not with a clean ending, but with a mirror that reflects 3 centuries of upheaval, from the crumbling stones of the Bastille to the frozen streets of Petrograd, to the humid mountains of the Sierra Maestra, and finally to the present moment, where the world's most influential nation stands at the edge of the same precipice. The pattern has repeated because the forces that drive it have never changed: economic pressure, political fracture, institutional distrust, the hunger for stability, and the desperate search for meaning in times of uncertainty. These forces do not belong to one ideology or one country. They belong to humanity itself. And today, they converge once again. The pattern revealed over the course of this documentary. We've explored the blueprint that has shaped revolutions for more than 300 years. A 6-stage sequence that begins subtly and ends violently. A process that transforms societies whether they intend it or not. Pressure builds. Economic inequality widens, elites compete, resources stretch thin, and ordinary people feel the weight of forces they cannot control. Legitimacy cracks. Institutions stumble, confidence falls, media narratives split, and trust, the invisible glue holding civilizations together, begins to dissolve. The spark. A scandal, a crisis, a disaster, an injustice. Something small ignites the dry powder accumulated over years. System breakdown. Authority weakens. The old guard clings to power. Movements rise. Narratives polarize. A nation stops believing in its own foundations. The power grab. A faction, a leader, or a coalition seizes the moment, whether through elections, emergency measures, or force. The new order. The revolution ends. A new system takes shape. Sometimes hopeful, often hardened, always irrevocably different from what came before. France, Russia, Cuba, all followed this trajectory, each in their own way. Each offered a warning. Each proved that once a society reaches stage 4, the path forward narrows dramatically. Stage 4 is the pivot point. Stage 4 is where nations decide their fate. Stage 4 is where the United States stands today. And yet, America is not France in 1789, not Russia in 1917, not Cuba in 1959. Its population is larger, its institutions older, its divisions deeper, its influence unmatched. The stakes are higher. The consequences global. But the pattern? The pattern remains. Echoes of the past in the modern world. This is the moment where history's lessons feel eerily close. In France, the monarchy assumed its institutions were too sacred to collapse. In Russia, the Tsar believed time was on his side. In Cuba, Batista thought fear would keep the people docile. All three leaders underestimated one thing: the speed at which trust can evaporate. They misread the temperature of their nations, misjudged the pressure of their people, and ignored the machinery of the pattern unfolding beneath them. By the time they acted, the momentum was irreversible. We see the same signals today. Polarized political tribes that no longer agree on basic reality. Media ecosystems that fracture truth into competing narratives. Institutions struggling to justify their authority. Economic pressures squeezing the middle class. Distrust, not of policies, but of each other. Stage 4 is not defined by violence. It is defined by a psychological break. A moment when a critical mass of the population no longer believes that the system can fix itself. A moment when people stop debating how to solve the problem and start debating which side is the enemy. This is the hinge of history, the point where the path splits. Some nations crawl back from the brink. Others plunge into stage 5. Lessons from the architects of revolution, as we examined the key figures: Robespierre, Napoleon, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Castro, Che. One truth stood out. Revolutions do not create extraordinary leaders. Extraordinary pressure creates extraordinary leaders. And those leaders shape the world in ways no election cycle or opinion poll can capture. Robespierre believed terror was the price of purity. Lenin believed revolution required total control of information. Stalin believed survival required eliminating every rival. Castro believed rebellion needed a symbol, and he became one. These men were not anomalies. They were inevitabilities of the pattern. They filled the vacuum left by broken systems, collapsing institutions, and societies searching for order in the chaos. This raises a haunting, unavoidable question. If America reaches stage 5, who will step into that vacuum? History never gives the same answer twice, but it always gives someone. The global stakes: the United States is not an isolated nation. It is a system woven into the fabric of global economics, politics, technology, and security. If it enters the final stages of the revolution pattern, the consequences will not stop at its borders. Financial markets will tremble. Alliances will shift. Rival powers will move. Smaller nations will scramble. The global order, the one built after 1945, will face its greatest test. This is not speculation. This is structural reality. Every revolution reshapes more than a government. It reshapes the balance of the world. When France fell, Europe entered decades of war. When Russia fell, the 20th century split into ideological camps. When Cuba fell, the Cold War edged closer to nuclear confrontation. When a superpower reaches stage 4, the world holds its breath. Standing on the edge of the sixth stage, and now, as the credits begin to roll on this historical investigation, we return to the central idea. Revolutions are not random. They are not accidents. They are not anomalies. They are cycles. Cycles driven by human nature, power imbalances, institutional decay, and the timeless truth that no system, no matter how strong, is immune to fracture. The United States is not destined to fall, but it is not exempt from the forces that toppled France, Russia, and Cuba. It stands at stage 4, the crossroads, the turning point, the moment where history waits for a decision. Will the nation stabilize or accelerate? Reform or rupture? Reconcile or fracture? History offers warnings, not prophecies. Patterns, not punishments. Lessons, not verdicts. The next chapter has not been written, but the ink is already on the table. Final reflection, as we leave the shadows of Paris, Petrograd, and Havana behind, one truth becomes unmistakable. Every revolution begins with a belief that change will bring freedom. But freedom is only preserved when societies understand the forces that shape them. This documentary has not revealed a conspiracy. It has revealed a mechanism that has operated for centuries, a mechanism now humming beneath our feet. Whether the United States becomes the next chapter in this pattern or the first nation to break it depends on choices being made right now, in government halls, in media rooms, in classrooms, in communities, and in the quiet moments when citizens decide what they believe and whom they trust. History is not a distant story. It is the stage we stand on, and the cycle continues until someone chooses to break it.